Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, October 29th, 2024. 1 week until Election Day, Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, is giving what her campaign calls a closing argument speech on the Ellipse, south of the White House, the same place where former President Donald Trump, the Republican presidential nominee, spoke on January 6, 2021, right before a mob of his supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol, trying to stop the counting of electoral votes, certifying his defeat to Joe Biden. Donald Trump today calling his Madison Square Garden rally from last weekend a love fest. Critics have condemned the crude, sexist, and racist remarks by the warm-up speakers, including a comedian referring to Puerto Rico as an island of garbage. Tonight, Donald Trump holds a rally in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Both presidential candidates have used podcast interviews as a campaign tool. We'll talk about the trend with Washington Post media critic Erik Wemple. President Joe Biden today visiting the Port of Baltimore to announce $3 billion in grants to upgrade ports around the country with climate-friendly equipment and infrastructure. The State Department reacts to Israel's parliament passing laws banning the United Nations Palestinian aid organization known as UNRWA. And Steve Bannon, former Trump White House advisor, is released from prison after serving 4 years for defying a congressional subpoena. NBC4 TV in Washington, D.C. writes that Vice President Kamala Harris will deliver her closing argument to voters Tuesday evening, just a short walk from the White House. The D.C. rally on the Ellipse may attract more than 52,000 people. D.C. Chief of Police Pamela Smith said Tuesday morning that organizers told her overflow crowds will be directed to the northeast grounds of the Washington Monument. The Ellipse is where former President Donald Trump held his Stop the Steal rally on January 6, 2021, shortly before members of the audience stormed the Capitol. That was from NBC4. Jen O'Malley Dillon is the Harris-Walz campaign manager. She was interviewed on MSNBC this morning about the Democratic presidential nominee's speech.
I think today you're going to hear from the vice president the choice before the American people. She's going to lay out a hopeful, optimistic vision for the future in a way that we can all turn the page from the chaos and division of Donald Trump. She's really focused on her to-do list, how she's going to deliver for the American people on the issues they really care about as she's traveled the country. She knows that costs are too high. She knows that people want to afford a home. They want to start a small business. She obviously understands the importance of fighting for everyone's freedom, especially reproductive freedom. So I think you're going to hear from her the very strong new way forward she's been laying out across the country, how she represents a new generation of leadership, but also how the American people deserve a leader who is focused on them. This isn't even about Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. It's about the American people. And I think the backdrop of the White House being at the Ellipse today, the last time a lot of the American people saw that was on January 6th. There is so much more we can do together, so much more hopeful future we can have. One of the things that is the hallmark of the events that the vice president has all across the country is people coming together and just having fun. You know, they're singing and they're dancing. It really is a joyful experience and an optimistic, hopeful gathering of people in their communities. And we think that we can bring people together, talk about the future, and really turn the page on Donald Trump.
Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, Harris-Walz campaign manager, this morning on MSNBC. NBC News has an article with some remarks as prepared by the vice president to give tonight. They include Donald Trump intends to use the United States military against American citizens who simply disagree with him, people he calls, quote, the enemy from within. This is not a candidate for president who is thinking about how to make your life better. Donald Trump has spent a decade trying to keep the American people divided and afraid of each other. That's who he is. But America, I'm here tonight to say that's not who we are. Some of the excerpts from Vice President Kamala Harris's speech tonight on the Ellipse south of the White House. Story from ABC News. Former President Donald Trump, Republican presidential nominee, denied knowing the comedian who made a slew of racist, sexist, and vulgar comments at his rally at Madison Square Garden. ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott reports that comedian Tony Hinchcliffe drew headlines in part for calling Puerto Rico an island of floating garbage. Trump told ABC Scott, I don't know him. Someone put him up there. I don't know who he is. The ABC article continues. Trump also insisted he didn't hear any of the comments, even as they've been played on television and written about extensively. When asked what he made of them, he did not take the opportunity to denounce them, repeating that he didn't hear the comments. His campaign has said the comedian's comments don't reflect the views of Trump or the campaign. That was reporting from ABC News. Donald Trump spoke this morning about last weekend's Madison Square Garden rally at Mar-a-Lago, his private club and home in Palm Beach, Florida.
I just wish they'd stop lying, because the lies are vicious, and probably some people believe them. But the good news is 7 states, Republicans never lead in the early voting because for whatever reason, it's habit or it's a certain security they feel in going to the booth. They believe in principle. But we never lead in. I don't know if we've ever led in early. Every single state we're leading in. Every single state. And in early. And we don't need all of them, but at it early. And some states are in play that nobody thought would ever be in play. But I think people are seeing, because again, we're the party of common sense. We're the party of common sense. And we want to have strong borders. We want to have great elections. We want to have fairness. We don't do things like, we're not going to have men playing in women's sports. I mean, that's okay. So we're the party of common sense, and we're the party of fairness, and we have a coalition. Nobody's ever seen anything like, I don't think anybody has ever seen anything like what happened the other night at Madison Square Garden. The love in that room. It was breathtaking, and you could have filled it many, many times with the people that were unable to get in. But politicians that have been doing this for a long time, 30 and 40 years, said there's never been an event so beautiful. It was like a love fest, an absolute love fest, and it was my honor to be involved. And hopefully, you know, they started to say, well, in 1939, the Nazis used Madison Square Garden. Well, and you know what? But can you imagine it? In 1939, the Nazi, they were. But how terrible to say, right? Because, you know, they've used Madison Square Garden many times. Many people have used it, but nobody's ever had a crowd like that. And I tell you what, right now, nobody's ever had love like that. That was love in the room, and it was love for our country. It was really love for our country. So we're going to fight like hell for the next 7 days, and then hopefully... And then hopefully, and most importantly, we're going to be fighting even harder for the next 4 years, because we're going to turn this around and we're going to make this country greater than it has ever been. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Former President Donald Trump, Republican presidential nominee at Mar-a-Lago, his home and private club in Florida. That was the last few minutes of an hour-long presentation, which we covered live on C-SPAN, and you can find the video at cspan.org. A Newsweek article about his rally tonight. Former President Trump's next rally will see him visit Allentown, Pennsylvania, a town with a large Puerto Rican community, just days after his last rally was condemned for including racist jokes about Puerto Rico. As Trump heads to Pennsylvania, the Puerto Rican community in the critical swing state, which numbers around 500,000, has mobilized to organize protests at his rally. That was the article from Newsweek. The Democratic and Republican vice presidential nominees are also in swing states today. Democrat Tim Walz, Minnesota governor, is in Georgia, and Republican J.D. Vance, U.S. Senator of Ohio, is in Michigan, both urging supporters to get to the polls on November 5th, or better yet, vote early. Here's Tim Walz in Savannah, Georgia.
I feel a little bit of anxiety these last 7 days. The news media, they want you to click on things because all of a sudden, exciting news about the election. So you click on it, you know, so they can make money or whatever. Look, don't take any of that. Don't take any of that. You know what the antidote is to the anxiety you're feeling? Go out and vote for Kamala Harris. That's right. Vote. We got it. We don't. You got it. That's our power. That's our power. Trump wants to talk about the past. Kamala's got a new way forward. She knows this economy works best when it works for all of us. That's the way it needs to be. I am incredibly proud to be on this ticket with her, especially for this, because you heard about the coaching and stuff. We've got real plans for America. Not concepts of plans, real plans. lower costs, put more money back in your pocket, and make sure that everybody in this country gets an opportunity to get ahead, not just get by. And I want to talk about this. Taking on the price gougers that we talk about, why are grocery prices so high? That's what farmers are asking. Why in the hell are farmers still making $4 a bushel for corn when fruit prices were 30% cheaper when they were making $4 for corn? Somebody's taking money in the middle. We'll attack that, making sure on the national level, take on price gougers. This issue about giving tax cuts, Donald Trump will do it. He will give tax cuts, but it will be for the richest amongst us. We want to give tax cuts to 100 million middle-class Americans, the folks who are working. This one is transformational. We did it in Minnesota. We did it during the pandemic. $6,000 child tax credit in the first year of that child's life. Matters. And this issue, you know this, they want to talk about things that don't impact you. The things that impact you, I see young folks in here too. Where are you going to find child care? Where are you going to find child care? How are you going to afford it? We're talking about making sure we're hiring more people to work in child care, and we're incentivizing and being able to subsidize some of the costs so that folks can get out and work. That makes a difference.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Democratic vice presidential nominee, today in Savannah, Georgia. Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, the Republican vice presidential nominee, made a campaign stop today in Saginaw, Michigan. After his speech, as he usually does, he took questions from reporters covering the rally. One question was about Michigan's automobile industry.
Hi, Senator. I'm Carol Thompson from the Detroit News. Thank you for taking a question. Given Elon Musk's large spending in this race, would a new Trump administration give preferential treatment to Tesla over the Detroit Big Three automakers?
No, of course not. Look, I'm personally thrilled to have Elon's support, and people have to remember, Elon was a center-left Clinton Democrat 4 years ago, and now he's putting on dark MAGA hats because he's sick of the craziness and wants to get back to common sense. And I think that's why. And I think that's why Elon is supporting our candidacy. It's not because he thinks that we're going to do anything for him. It's because he thinks that we're going to make the American nation more peaceful, more prosperous, and more secure, and that's what we're going to do. Now, of course, look, I love the big three automakers in the state of Michigan. I want the big three automakers to thrive and to survive, but they're not going to if we keep on forcing electric vehicles made in China down the throats of American consumers and American workers. So obviously, Elon is very interested in electric vehicles, and the president, ribs him from time to time that, look, if you want to make electric vehicles, great. We don't want to force anybody to drive anything. That's the whole point. But our belief is that the way to empower the American automobile industry is to let consumers decide and let Michigan workers do what they do best, which is make great automobiles.
Senator J.D. Vance, Republican vice presidential nominee in Saginaw, Michigan. Senator Vance is planning to sit down for an interview with popular podcast host Joe Rogan on Wednesday. Rogan posting on X today that Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, did not decline to go on his podcast, but that he did not agree to the campaign's terms, that he traveled to her instead of doing it at his studio in Austin, Texas, and that it be limited to 1 hour. Joe Rogan says he still thinks something can be worked out. He writes, "My sincere wish is to just have a nice conversation and get to know her as a human being. I really hope we can make it happen." A Washington Post opinion column has the headline, "Podcasts are dominating the 2024 election. Why?" Erik Wemple, Washington Post media critic, is the writer and joins us now. Thank you for being with us. Did you find an answer to that question? Why?
Yeah, kind of. I think that, politicians increasingly sort of want to go into low-pressure situations where they can really sort of stretch out and tell people who they are and just sort of not be in this sort of pressure cooker environment, which is traditionally how it goes with more mainstream outlets. So they give the podcasters a lot of time, and they just enjoy the conversation. And it's good for them, and I think to a certain extent also good for the political system.
has there been a discernible strategy from the Harris and Trump presidential campaigns about which podcast they're going to go on?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, like Harris, I think that they, like a strategy, yes. A sort of a directional or a general strategy is that they think that people who lurk on the internet or, on podcasts or away from mainstream news outlets, that there are more who perhaps haven't made up their mind. And there's some data to support that, right? There's some data that people get news from social media and from the internet, podcasts, maybe is a group with at least a larger proportion or percentage of undecided or uncommitted voters than, say, the audience for CNN or certainly MSNBC or Fox News, which are really heavily committed people. So the uncommitted folks is what they're looking for. It may not be a perfect strategy. That may not be a surefire approach because, sort of like the political leanings of various media audiences are really difficult to ascertain. It's not like, we can look at the census report and figure these things out. But it's not a bad way of sort of like of groping in the dark for a winning strategy, I would say.
You also write at your opinion piece at WashingtonPost.com about how other journalists, mainstream legacy media, are trying to figure out how to cover the podcast interviews. What's been the problem there?
Well, I don't know if there's a problem so much as that, it's just that I think that traditionally mainstream journalists are interested in accountability journalism, and they want to see certain questions be answered by these candidates, and the podcasts are not necessarily producing the grilling that they're looking for. So that there may not be a lot of news coming out of these podcasts. Sometimes there is. I mean, like you would have, from the Howard Stern interview, you would have learned that Kamala Harris likes to eat Special K for breakfast once in a while. She likes cereal. So, like, that is something that I think people are interested to know. Trump is famously verbose and really doesn't stop talking at his rallies, and it's the same way in these interviews. And even when you ask him pointed questions, he's going to say what he wants to say regardless. So I just think that there is sort of a disconnect between what happens in those podcasts and how mainstream news there is something of a culture clash, I think, in general between traditional news organizations and podcasters. Let's put it that way.
We're talking with Washington Post media critic Erik Wemple. How much power do podcast hosts have at this point in the evolution of the technology and how people are using it?
Well, I think some of them have an enormous amount of reach and power. I mean, like Josh Rogan, he's a he's a billionaire tens of times over. He has a huge audience of millions of people. I think that his YouTube audience is it's enormous. The number's escaping me right now, but they go out to a lot of people, and their social media long tail is really long. So, like when they have a little discussion, Rogan's comments, Trump's comments get clipped and recirculated into on the internet extensively. So these things are hard to miss. And, CNN, Fox News, so on and so forth, MSNBC, they too have pretty good recirculation. But, like the people who are fans of Rogan, of a guy like Joe Rogan, I think they're a little more hardcore than, for example, the fans of Dana Bash or Jake Tapper. These people who follow podcasts become really attached to that person in a way that they may not really do with respect to mainstream media journalists. I mean, Margaret Brennan, are there really that many, she's a CBS News host. Do you think there are that many people who are rabid Margaret Brennan fans? I don't think so. I think she's a good journalist, but they don't establish the sort of bind that some of these fans do with their podcast hosts. It's a really intimate and strong bond that they have.
And a final question: you point out that in your article, your opinion piece, that podcasts have been around for about 2 decades, but this cycle they've really come into their own in the political sphere. What do you think the future holds?
That is a great question. It's really hard to sort of to suss out. But you know what? Like, I could see this being a pretty strong indicator of where things will go in the future. And that is that, like, if you're a candidate and you don't do these sort of personality-driven interviews on podcasts, you're not going to really reach out to the people and explain who you are and what sort of person you are. And if you don't do the accountability stuff on the mainstream news organizations, there's going to be a lot of chatter about that. Because when Harris was initially not going on, not doing a lot of the accountability stuff and not answering a lot of questions from the traveling media, she was really getting hammered for that. And that's not a good look. That's not good publicity for the campaign. And that's something that itself that gets recirculated and the criticism gets repeated over and over again. So my guess is that maybe this is a pattern that will sustain itself for a while. Just a guess.
Erik Wemple, Washington Post media critic. Find his articles at WashingtonPost.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A story from CNN: with the 2024 presidential contest expected to be the most litigated in American history, both campaigns have spent years laying the groundwork for a post-election courtroom battle by recruiting lawyers in every state, wargaming possible scenarios, and drafting potential pleadings. Courts across the country have been flooded with lawsuits far earlier than in the 2020 election, mostly from Republican-aligned groups challenging everything from ballot rules to voter qualifications, and the legal challenges could continue for weeks or months to come. That was from CNN. Ben Ginsberg is co-chair of the Election Official Defense Network. He talked about what he's been seeing during a panel discussion hosted by the Brookings Institution.
I think we will undoubtedly see a lot of litigation that will matter only if the margins are close. The number of suits that have been filed pre-election are telling that there is at least a plan to litigate a lot afterwards. Interestingly, the cases filed pre-election don't really ask, for the most part, for any sort of judicial relief before the election. So they are designed to set the tone, perhaps do some judge shopping, and to sort of seed the grounds for these post-election ones. Again, the success of those cases and whether there has to be another lost not stolen report depends on the evidence that can be gathered. I mean, the rubber hits the road, and the evidence that you can provide for cases. And so far, there has not been the evidence produced to back up any of those cases. One thing about the media, though, and it is important to rebut and really pre-but many of the allegations that you know are coming. I would agree that many media outlets are doing a fine job of reporting on this issue. The problem is we are in such bubbles today that the people who you really want to reach aren't reading the Washington Post and the New York Times or watching MSNBC or CNN. So there's still a real information problem, at least on a national basis. It is another reason to go local because, in point of fact, the polling shows that local TV is actually what more people across the political spectrum are using to get their information. And on top of that is the really difficult situation that you do see the presidential candidates not caring so much about 60 Minutes and network news programs, but going to podcasts with their massive audiences, which tells you that the fighting disinformation battle is perhaps being fought on the wrong turf when we think about news organizations as the main point.
Ben Ginsberg is Election Official Defense Network co-chair, an election lawyer known in the past for working for Republican candidates, speaking at the Brookings Institution on Monday, an event titled Making Every Vote Count, Protecting Election Integrity. Story from the Miami Herald: containers with hundreds of Miami-Dade ballots were found on the side of the road overnight after they fell out of a county truck, the Elections Department confirmed Tuesday. The worker forgot to lock the back of the truck, and as they drove off, one sealed bin and one sealed bag fell out, Christina White, the county's election supervisor, said Tuesday morning. She said the containers remained sealed and that the ballots inside had already been scanned and tabulated. At the South Dade Regional Library's early voting site on Monday, a passing driver retrieved the crate and the satchel with the ballots on a road near Florida's Turnpike in Cutler Bay, according to the video posted by Only in Dade. That was reporting from Miami Herald. In addition to covering the presidential race, C-SPAN has been covering U.S. Senate, U.S. House, governorships, some of the key debates from the Maine Morning Star. 3 of the 4 candidates running to represent Maine in the U.S. Senate took to the stage Monday night for their first televised debate. U.S. Senator Angus King, an independent who has held the seat since 2013, faced off against Democrat David Costello and Republican Demi Kouzounis on key issues including reproductive rights, cost of living, and immigration. The debate was hosted by WGME and the Bangor Daily News. That was from the Maine Morning Star. Here is part of that debate, a question on the economy.
4 out of 5 voters surveyed say they believe the economy is extremely important to them in this election, nationally and in the state of Maine. Do you personally feel better off than you did 4 or 6 years ago? And why should voters put their trust in you to help them feel better off than they did now, and maybe how they can feel better off in 6 years? And again, based on our alternating format, let's start with David Costello. And if you would, please tell us, are you feeling personally better off?
I am feeling personally better off. And I think if you go back to 2008 and the Great Recession, you'll understand how bad the economy was back in 2008 and what a wonderful job the Obama administration had done to actually pull us out of the deepest recession since the Great Depression. And I think if you look at that economy as it rolled into the Trump administration, unemployment was down, inflation was below 2%. So actually, and the job creation numbers were quite significant. And so I think as you look, the problem we had obviously most recently is the pandemic. If you want to look at one single cause, the simple explanation of the economy, of economics, is supply and demand. And obviously because of the pandemic, we had a major supply chain problem. And we continue to have demand. So obviously a lot of Americans now feel the effects still of that pandemic. And so what obviously the Biden administration has been able to do is because of what the Fed has done, we've brought the inflation level down to under 3%. So that's been calmed. And many of the actions they've taken to provide the right kind of resources for families to address the cost of living, much of that has taken place as well.
Thank you very much, David Costello. We'll have a chance maybe to come back to you on this, but to give a chance to everyone to respond. Same question to you, Senator King. First of all, again, do you personally feel better off, and why should people trust you on the economy?
Well, I think, number one, there are indicators that we are better off. Whenever I have businesses come to me, when I talk to businesses around the state, the number one problem they have is workforce, not enough workers. It used to be we were worried about how many jobs. Now we're worried about how to fill that workforce. That's a sign of a strong economy. On the other hand, you asked how I feel. Every time I go to Hanford Brothers and have to pay $3 or $4 for almost $4 for a gallon of milk, that's not good. And that's something that people are really focused upon. I've got kids here in Maine. They're talking about buying houses, and the high cost of housing is also a tremendous problem. I think it's one of the most serious problems Maine's facing. So, yeah, there are indicators that the economy is doing much better. Inflation is down, unemployment is down, the stock market is at record levels. But I don't think people are feeling that in their daily lives, and that's something that I think we've got to continue to work at.
All right, thank you very much. And same question, Demi Kouzounis. The floor is yours. 1 minute, please.
Absolutely. I think the opposite is true. If you talk to the average Mainer, the people that are struggling every day, you're going to find that they're not doing any better. Inflation is not down. The rate of inflation is slowing down. We're still at 21%. That has not diminished. We have energy costs that are going through the roof, and we're subsidizing now solar and wind. That is affecting a lot of the folks in the state of Maine. Housing. Prices of housing is up 40%. That is due to a lot of issues, but one of the reasons is because we're having a lot of people come into our state. We haven't kept up with the building of housing because of regulations, because of interest rates, and other problems. Workforce, I think that's a great issue that we need to deal with. We have 4% less people working in the state of Maine than pre-COVID, but the people that we need to bring it to Maine, which is healthcare providers, and I would know about that, are not being able to find housing, so they're not being able to come in. Our doctors, our dentists, our hygienists, assistants, they haven't got housing and not able to come to the state to fill in that workforce.
U.S. Senate debate from the state of Maine. The candidates, incumbent Angus King, an independent running for a third six-year term, and the challengers, David Costello, a Democrat, environmental policy consultant, and Demi Kusunis, a former Maine Republican Party chair and a dentist. Monday night, debating in Portland, Maine. The Cook Political Report rates this as a solid Democratic seat. Angus King caucuses with the Democrats. You can find all of C-SPAN's Campaign 2024 coverage at our website, cspan.org. Washington Today continues in a moment.
This election night, C-SPAN delivers something different. Not just the presidential race, but the state races that will decide the balance of power in Congress. No political pundits, no spin, no commercials. Just the candidates, the results, and you. Follow C-SPAN this election night beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern. Live Tuesday, November 5th on TV, online, or on the free C-SPAN Now video app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. Story from Associated Press. The Biden administration is awarding nearly $3 billion to boost climate-friendly equipment and infrastructure at ports across the country, including Baltimore, where a bridge collapse killed 6 construction workers in March and disrupted East Coast shipping routes for months. President Joe Biden was set to visit the city's main port Tuesday to announce the grants, which officials say will improve and electrify port infrastructure at 55 sites nationwide, while supporting an estimated 40,000 union jobs, reducing pollution, and combating the climate crisis. The presidential visit, a week before Election Day, is intended to highlight efforts by Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris to promote clean energy while protecting and creating jobs. That was the preview article from AP. Here's President Joe Biden at the Port of Baltimore.
For years, I've been saying it's not enough just to rebuild America. We have to build it back better and stronger than before. That's why today I'm proud to announce we're delivering $3 billion in funding from my Inflation Reduction Act to help clean up and modernize ports in 27 different states and territories, from Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and beyond, including, yes, Puerto Rico. I'd like to take that guy for a swim out there. Anyway. Stenny's looking at me, don't get going, Joe. Don't get going, Joe. Slow up. But this also includes a $447 million for the Port of Baltimore to upgrade its cargo equipment, infrastructure, and power grid. Folks, ports are the linchpin to America's supply chain. They keep goods moving, keep the economy strong. They employ over 100,000 union workers, from Teamsters to longshoremen. But for too long, they've run on fossil fuels and aging infrastructure, putting workers at risk and exposing nearby communities to dangerous pollution. Studies show more childhood asthma, lung disease, and heart disease and cancer in folks who live close to ports. This is about environmental justice. I asked Gloria, who you heard from earlier, or any of the neighbors in Turner Station, or across the water in Curtis City, communities too long left behind. Simply wrong. The new $3 billion funding we're delivering today will help ports and communities all across America. It will cut ports' opening costs, strengthen supply chains, make America businesses more competitive, and keep consumer prices down while slashing carbon pollution and support an estimated 40,000 new good-paying jobs at the port in clean energy manufacturing all across America. In fact, the funding for this port is estimated to create 2,000 new jobs. Jobs for longshoremen, iron workers, engineers, electricians, utility workers, steel workers, laborers, and so much more. Good-paying union jobs you can raise a family on. A lot of colleagues agree.
President Joe Biden today at the Port of Baltimore in Maryland. That port has more than 20,000 workers, including longshoremen and truckers, who are unionized, supporting operations. It's a major hub for import and export of cars and farm equipment. From the American Bankers Association Banking Journal, in a keynote speech at the ABA annual convention today, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen unveiled a new national strategy for financial inclusion, focused on access to transaction accounts, safe and affordable credit, and savings and retirement opportunities. It also focuses on actions the federal government can take in its payment and support programs and enhancing the protection of consumers from illegal and predatory practices. That was from the ABA Banking Journal. Their convention was held in New York City. In a conversation after Secretary Yellen's speech, the president and CEO of the ABA, Rob Nichols, asked about government regulations.
We have talked about kind of the regulatory tsunami, all these independent agency regulations. Each one not a mortal wound to a bank, particularly a bank, but in aggregate, the cumulative impact is a lot. And don't you think that's something we should study? And if there was a government agency that could do that and look at the cumulative impact of all that regulation, particularly on our nation's economic prospects going forward, would that be a valid exercise?
Well, I think it's something that's important for the bank regulators to be doing, and certainly we've been hearing loud and clear from the banking community that the burdens of compliance have become quite extraordinary. I think one principle that's helpful is tailoring, trying to make sure that the complexity and severity of the regulations fit the footprint of the activities of banks of different sizes and complexity. But there are so many areas that are important, to my mind, no longer being directly a bank regulator, but worrying about financial stability and the strength of the economy, knowing how important it is to have a healthy banking system in order to have a healthy and resilient economy. I guess my predilection is very much toward robust capital liquidity to make sure that we do have a banking system that can support the economy, that's safe and sound. And I think, a lot of people worried in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Dodd-Frank was passed, regulation really ramped up at that point, that the United States banks wouldn't be able to compete, that the regulatory burden was so severe it would make our banks non-competitive. I think if you actually study what's happened, you'd see that that wasn't the case. I mean, I'm not denying that there are significant burdens on banks, but I think we have a strong, sound banking system that's very well placed to compete. And when the pandemic struck and we saw a huge amount of financial turbulence, I think we were really fortunate, and it aided our recovery, that we had a banking system that was able, in an emergency like that, to provide businesses and households with the credit that they needed to survive what was just an incredible stress. So I recognize that there is a substantial burden. It continues to evolve as we deal with the cloud, with non-banks, with third-party service providers, with cyber attacks. and a growing list of matters that all banking institutions need to be attentive to. But I hope that tailoring can help to reduce the burden for the smaller banks.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen questioned by the American Bankers Association President and CEO Rob Nichols at the ABA's annual convention in New York City today. On Wall Street, the Dow down 154, NASDAQ up 145, S&P up 9. From CNN, the White House said a new consumer confidence survey shows good real income growth, strong employment, and inflation that is back down to the level before the pandemic in a statement on the Conference Board's latest consumer survey. And from Marine Times, Veterans Affairs officials on Tuesday announced record high levels of medical care delivery and disability benefits payouts in fiscal 2024, but also promised to push those marks even further in coming months with efforts to broaden support for veterans. On the medical front, VA saw its highest level of health care appointments ever in fiscal 2024, about $127.5 million, up 6% over the previous fiscal year. More than 796,000 veterans have enrolled in VA health care in the last 2 fiscal years, up 37% from the previous 24 months. And on the benefits side, the department processed 2.5 million disability benefit claims in fiscal 2024, a 27% increase over fiscal 2023. That was some of the reporting from the Marine Times. VA Secretary Dennis McDonough spoke about this today at the National Press Club in Washington. During his speech, he also said his department is taking some steps to close a gap in PACT Act coverage.
It's almost exactly 23 years ago, October 5th, 2001. When the first U.S. forces arrived at the Karshi-Khanabad Air Base in Uzbekistan, former Soviet air base that we all know now as K2. K2 veterans were among the first to deploy after the September 11th terrorist attacks, bravely conducting and supporting combat missions against al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. They went to a place at K2 that veterans often describe as a toxic soup of exposures, a place unlike other operating bases occupied by American forces, a place that jeopardized their immediate and long-term health. Colonel Gordon Peters, a doc who deployed with those early units, vividly describes what he says was a, quote, chemical odor so intense that it seemed as if someone could light a match, the entire area would ignite. Some K2 vets returned home, developed disabling illnesses and conditions. Their service in those conditions is heroic. Mindful of the passage of time since their heroic service, we've moved aggressively to care for K2 vets since the PACT Act was enacted in 2022. First, we eliminated the PACT Act phase-in period for presumptive benefits, making all K2 vets immediately eligible for more than 300 presumptive conditions. Second, earlier this year, we made all K2 veterans eligible for VA health care, whether or not they filed a benefits claim with VA. Third, after consulting with K2 vets this summer, we've begun rulemaking to make chronic multi-symptom illness, also known as Gulf War illness, a presumptive condition for K2 vets, fixing a gap in the PACT Act. Fourth, for every K2 claim, we've made sure that the unique toxic exposures at K2, that toxic soup, is taken into account, and each new K2 claim gets reviewed a second time before any final decision is reached. Fifth, we've reached out to every known living K2 veteran to encourage them to come to us for the care and the benefits that they have earned and so richly deserve.
Veterans Affairs Department Secretary Dennis McDonough at the National Press Club in Washington today. Story from Al Jazeera. Israel's move to ban the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA, marks a new level in its war with the UN, the Palestinian envoy to the UN has said. The Israeli parliament, or Knesset, approved bills on Monday aimed at banning UNRWA from operating in Israel. UNRWA supports Palestinian refugees in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem, as well as surrounding countries. Palestinian envoy to the UN, Riyad Mansour, told the UN Security Council on Tuesday that the Knesset's legislation to ban UNRWA constitutes a new level in this war against the UN and an integral part of an all-out assault on the Palestinian people. That was the article from Al Jazeera. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller in Washington, D.C., asked about the United States position.
Yesterday at the briefing, shortly before the Knesset voted on these two bills that deal with UNRWA use, once again reiterated the U.S. position that they shouldn't do it and that the law shouldn't be passed, and that if they were, there should be steps taken to mitigate the situation. So now that the laws have both passed, and recognizing that they won't take effect for another 2 months or so, at least, what is your response, and what are you planning to do, particularly given the emphasis that you guys, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin in particular, have put on improving the aid supply into Gaza?
Yeah. Let me start by just reiterating that we are deeply troubled by this legislation. It could shutter UNRWA operations in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem. It poses risks for millions of Palestinians who rely on UNRWA for essential services, including health care and primary and secondary education. UNRWA, of course, plays a critical role in providing services to Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and throughout the wider region, and particularly in Gaza. They play a role right now that, at least today, cannot be filled by anyone else. They are a key partner in delivering food, water, and other humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza that wouldn't have anyone else to get it from if UNRWA were to go away. So we have made clear our concerns over this bill. We have made clear our opposition to this bill. As the Secretary said in his letter, and as I reiterated yesterday, there could be consequences under U.S. law and U.S. policy for the implementation of this legislation. We are going to engage with the government of Israel in the days ahead about how they plan to implement it. We're going to watch and see if there are legal challenges to the law and if there's any impact by those legal challenges. And then we'll make our decisions after looking at all of those factors.
U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference at the State Department in Washington. New York Times article has a story: an Israeli strike on a residential building in northern Gaza killed dozens of people early Tuesday, the territory's emergency service said, in the latest attack to cause mass casualties in the area since Israel renewed its offensive against Hamas in the north. From Associated Press, out of New York, longtime Donald Trump ally Steve Bannon was released from federal prison early Tuesday and immediately resumed his full-throated support for the former president, urging Republicans to turn out in large numbers next week to defeat Democratic nominee Vice President Kamala Harris. Bannon served a 4-month sentence for defying a subpoena in the congressional investigation into the U.S. Capitol attack on January 6, 2021. He left the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut in the pre-dawn hours and headed to Manhattan, where he resumed his War Room podcast, an online show, and later held an afternoon news conference. That was the article from Associated Press. Here's that news conference.
They thought they would shut down the War Room and take our power away. The show is bigger and more powerful than it's ever been. And please, it's not a podcast. We take the live streaming television show every day and the radio show, and we turn it into a podcast. So my brothers and sisters at CNN, when you say the podcast number is off slightly, right? It hasn't. We were the largest podcast, but we're streaming. We stream on television, and we play on radio and online. And Nancy Pelosi thought a federal prison was going to break me. Well, it empowered me. It empowered me. I am more empowered today, more focused today, sharper today, in better shape today than I've ever been in my entire life. So Nancy Pelosi, suck on that.
Steve Bannon, former Donald Trump chief White House strategist at a news conference today in New York City after being released from federal prison earlier this morning after serving a 4-month sentence for not complying with the congressional subpoena in the investigation of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Steve Bannon, as he noted, hosted his podcast War Room this morning. Mark Elias, founder of Democracy Docket, an elections lawyer for the Democratic Party, writing on X, Steve Bannon wasn't out of jail for 12 hours today before he talked about me 3 times. Apparently, I've been living rent-free in his head, even while behind bars. As his guests admit, my team of lawyers is better than the GOP's, and we're ready to beat them again in 2024. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.